Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to this next session at Biotechgate Digital Partnering event. So it's a full week of partnering we have, and we have some very interesting sessions going on throughout this week. And I'm very pleased, to have this next session. We have been working with Christian and Broadreach Global for a couple of years, and he's always able to put together very interesting panels, interesting topics. We are talking about the EU Pharma and the Orphan designation in Europe, and what that means for biotech and pharma in Europe. So we're looking forward to that panel. And yeah, I'm handing over to you, Christian, and you take it from here.
Thanks, Patrick. It's always a pleasure to be here and to do these meetings with you. So we have panelists sitting in a few different places. I'll start by saying this topic, the EU pharmaceutical package, is an impending package of legislation that will have more impact in terms of the biotech sector in Europe than anything in the past 20 years and probably in the next 20 years. So it is coming. The question is, how good and constructive or how bad and destructive will it be? And there are some indications on both sides. I have a bit of an opinion on this, but we're going to discuss with the panelists. So we have a really good panel, and I encourage you in the audience to join in, to listen. We'll ask for your questions as we get going, once we get through the presentation. If you are building a biotech company in Europe, if you're an investor, if you're at a bioregion, this matters to you. This could radically change the ecosystem and the environment for biotech in Europe. It may not, depending on how things come together over the coming year or so. But the potential is there for slightly positive or potentially quite negative impacts. So with that, I don't want to go further into it, but it's important to get your colleagues to join in. I'm going to introduce our panelists briefly. We have Katja Murray, who is a Senior Director of Healthcare and Life Sciences at FTI Public Affairs in Brussels. And Katja has a background in pharma in both Scandinavia and the UK, and working at the European level. We have Sally Shorthose, who I'm not going to get the full title right, but is a partner at Bird & Bird in London and head of the life sciences IP practice, amongst other things. And I know tends to often wear the hat for Bird & Bird on leading what European legislation and relations with Europe mean for biotech and pharmaceutical sector clients. And then we have Mark Treherne, who has an interesting background as a commercial scientist at Big Pharma, as a serial founder of Biotech with a few exits, and as an investor and board member at a number of companies. And also, going back to when I first met Mark, he did a stint running the UK's life sciences organization and had his hand in policy a few times over the years, so understands that world as well. We're going to try to talk about what this means for people in the biotech sector and for our companies, for our investors, for our bioregions, for the ecosystem in Europe, and for patients. So I think it's important. With that, I'd like to ask each of you to give a slightly more detailed intro of yourself, maybe take a minute, and then Katja will do a presentation to explain what is actually happening, what's being proposed and discussed. I'll ask Sally to clarify a few things, and then we'll get into a discussion on considering the potential impact and how we as a sector may want to react to this. So Katja, can I start with you? I've given you an intro, but it's an incomplete one. So what did I miss out? What should the audience know?
Well, thanks a lot for this opportunity to join today. I'm really looking forward to the discussions. Yes, so as you said, my background is very much in policy and in strategic communication. I was been with the pharma industry for the last, 14, 15 years. And I started my career in pharma, where I built the global public affairs function. I then moved to London, where I was with GSK for 5 years and quite deeply involved in Brexit and also the COVID pandemic, and then moved to FTI 2 years ago, where I'm supporting a number of companies. Many of them are in the rare space and biotech startup on really understanding some of the moving pieces of EU politics, be the short version, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Katja. And Sally, I know I left stuff out, so the more important aspects of your core focus and role.
So I'm a lawyer. I have a mixed bag in that I spent a long time in private practice, but also a long time in-house. I was at ICI, which ages me because it's now AstraZeneca, and I was legal director at Novartis. But I've been back in private practice for about 20 years, and I do transactional IP work, which is mostly in the life sciences arena. And I have a big regulatory practice in life sciences as well, and offer those two overlap in advising clients. So I don't litigate, much to the frustration of some of my litigation partners, because they do say if I get close to a dispute, I tend to settle it. So I tend to think that's a better way through. And I am fascinated by this area, and have a dog under my leg, my arm. And I think we have a long way to go before we actually find out what the shape of this package is going to look like. So really looking forward to discussing with everybody.
Thanks, Sally. And Mark, I've given you, I've picked what I wanted to emphasize, but what should the audience know about you?
Well, thanks very much. I think you covered most of the key bits, but as you sort of said, I'm a scientist by training. I still claim I am a scientist. Real scientists may say I've gone a bit too commercial these days. Was originally an academic, then worked in large pharma as a therapeutic area head, and then moved into the mad world of biotech and been through several cycles of that. As you said, I had a short stint in the UK government, where I was responsible for bringing inward investment into the UK and helping UK companies export overseas. That was obviously pre-Brexit, and I moved back into the private world. I do have a very small government role now. I sit on the Council of Innovate UK, which is the innovation agency in the UK. So I see investment from a UK perspective, but having started off my commercial career at Pfizer, Pfizer always were a very international company, and large companies can make decisions anywhere in the world, and ultimately, innovation can be created anywhere and exploited anywhere. So it's very mobile, it's very label, and actually, as we're doing today, we can do everything online, right? When I started off in Pfizer, we all went to special rooms where we had special teleconferencing rooms that you had to book in advance and make sure you had the bandwidth. Now we can do it on our phones. So I think in a very, very different world, intellectual property, money, and patients are global. How can Europe remain competitive in a very fast and rapidly changing world?
And I think that's a great opening statement and a great question to pose. So with that, Katja, let's go to you, and why don't you take us through a bit of the background and where this is coming from and what is actually happening, what's under discussion, and then we can talk about some of the specifics of it, the things that may be of concern, that may be of interest, and which we might want to look into. I'll be here, I'll be on mute, just to pass it over to you. And if anybody in the audience has a question, just type it in and we will get to it in the discussion, I promise. So just feel free to use the Q&A function and we will not ignore you. It just may take several minutes before we get to you. All right, Katja, all yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So basically, I'll spend the next 10 minutes to walk you through the EU pharmaceutical package. I think it's important to say up front that this is currently a proposal. So it's a legislative proposal from the European Commission, which came back in April 2023. And it's important to say that at the moment, what we're looking at is what was proposed by the European Commission. So I'm going to take us through kind of the different elements. But as this is kind of ongoing at the moment, actually it's very much ongoing in the European Parliament, because they're having kind of some of their final discussions at the moment. So in the European Union, the European Parliament and the member states have co-decision. So therefore, we would expect that the final decision on this legislation will only happen probably around the end of 2025, which means that legislation will enter into force around 2028. That's the kind of assumptions at the moment. So it's just important to say that the elements here, that's what was proposed by the Commission. Once the final decision is there, it could look different. So there might be changes.
That being said, the time to comment on it and try to move the needle is now, not in a year's time, when it will all be sort of, as it's coming together, it will be almost written in stone.
Exactly. I think that's a really good point. I think I want to start with really setting the scene, and this might be very basic for some, and for some it might just be a nice, helpful repetition. But it's important to say that with the Commission and you can say EU health policy, everything the Commission can propose is based on kind of the treaties. So what they have a mandate to really put forward. And as the division is with the, you can say with the treaty, and especially Article 168, is basically that the Commission has huge, you can say, impact in certain areas across Europe. Of course, one of the main ones being in the process of the marketing authorization. So the European Medicine Agency, which grants a marketing authorization to basically launch a product in the EU, is under the European Commission, and that's kind of a pan, you can say, EU approach. Then we saw under COVID also joint procurement of COVID vaccines, but that was quite an exceptional case. And then we also see some research funding. What is really important to say is that at a national level, all decisions about price and reimbursement are national. HTA procedures, there will be some joint clinical assessment. We won't get into this, but basically it's important to say the pricing, the reimbursement, also how you manage your healthcare system, it's a national competency, and this will not change. So what we will see with the pharma package is a proposal that kind of balances within this power balance that we currently have between the EU and the member states. But basically, fundamentally, the power balance will not change in the treaties. Then there can be a lot of nerdy discussions about will the power balance change anyway, but it's not changing what is already kind of decided in the treaty. So I just wanted to start with kind of that, setting the scene, that the treaties are not changing with the pharmaceutical package. So what is it we see, and also maybe just giving a little bit of, before I go into the details of the pharmaceutical package, I wanted to give a little bit of background on also, you know, why these political objectives, and I think it's fair to say that the reactions from the industry have not been welcoming. I mean, there has been a lot of concerns around this package and what is proposed. So just to kind of try to understand, like, why is this coming, and also what are the kind of political ambitions? Just to go a little bit back in time to say, like, some of the first really milestones were probably in 2016, when the Dutch, in their kind of council conclusions under the Dutch presidency, started to kind of, I would say, put forward some of the thinking we are seeing at the moment, basically saying, being, you know, putting, I think for the first time, really putting some stronger language around the concerns around, you know, are companies getting incentives to bring new innovation to the market, meeting kind of high unmet medical needs, and with all that innovation coming, do we then balance this act of also allowing EU citizens to actually access this medicine? Do they have a chance to kind of get access to the newest treatment within various type of diseases, or are there some practices that means that actually not all EU citizens will get access? So some of the big topics on the table around both innovation, about meeting unmet medical needs, but also very much this whole thing about access and affordability was already introduced with the Dutch. And I would say a lot of, I mean, especially the Dutch, but a number of member states have really been pushing the European Commission to say we want a revision of the existing pharma legislation, because we don't believe that it's currently meeting those objectives. So this is to kind of explain what is the political, you can say, ambition and also the mandate, and that was kind of really encouraging the Commission to then come up with this revision of the pharma legislation. So what we are seeing is basically that we have the pharmaceutical package being proposed, and I'll get into the details in a minute, but overall, we see some of this language again, like the whole discussion about access to new medicines and inequalities in access. And when we talk about inequalities in access, it's more like saying it might be that most Germans would get access to all the new treatments, but what about people in Romania? When will they get access to the same type of treatment? So it's this kind of balance across the EU. Also, the whole discussion about medicines and pricing and very much transparency is some discussions that we have heard previously also around, how much money is actually invested into R&D. Is it kind of reflecting fairly kind of the price of the medicine? And a lot of discussions, and I would say quite a number of people in the European Parliament are now pushing for more transparency to say we want to see the numbers, how much public funding was invested into developing this new molecule. Then there's also the whole element around sustainability and shortages. And sustainability is really trying to kind of say that for medicines, it is, there's an element of you can say chemistry, of course, and so far medicines have kind of been exempted for when we discuss environmental, like the Green Deal and other things, but now looking into, are there actually some of these molecules that are harmful for the environment, and what to do about it. Shortages has been like a rising topic, especially after the COVID pandemic, where we saw a rising concern that some of the APIs are being manufactured outside of Europe and putting, you can say, Europe at a risk of shortages. And finally, with this whole mix, there's also an ambition to remain competitive in Europe. And when we talk about being competitive, it's very much up against, like you can say, the big, like the US, of course, in their role, and also the role of China, Japan in terms of life science. So very shortly, when the Commission proposed this legislation, they kind of like said we have the AAA, which is access, affordability, and availability. And then we also have the CCC, which is remaining competitive, compliance, and also combating AMR, which we won't come too much into now, but that's kind of the big picture. So diving a little bit more into the details. So what is the big, you can say, change, and what is really new with the pharma package? And this is to put it very simply. I'm sure that Sally will put a lot more words and details into it. But very simply, I think the big change is that with the pharma package, there's this new concept called modulation. And what we mean with modulation is that, you can say, from the perspective of some member states, when you have a new product getting marketing authorization, before you automatically got a number of years to protect your data and your market. Now you will only gain the same number of years if you also meet some requirements, which is launching, which is meeting high unmet medical needs, and a few other things you can meet, which I'll come into now. So basically, from the side of the Commission, they kind of thought in the past we mainly had the carrot for the industry, but there was not a real stick. So what is the pharma package is really introducing this stick to try to get the life science industry to also meet those objectives. So that's kind of, you can say, the whole core of the pharma package. And also, as I said in the beginning, because of the, you can say, power division between the Commission and the member states, then the main tool in the toolbox that the Commission has is really the European Medicine Agency. And therefore, we also see a lot of these measures being introduced will actually grant more power to the European Medicine Agency to actually can say implement some of these measures. Because even if you want to get affordability, the Commission don't have the mandate to change pricing at a national level. So going to one of the main components in the pharma package, which has been, I would say, the piece that is most debated amongst industry and policymakers, is this whole piece about regulatory data protection, which for the orphan medicines would be market exclusivity. So to put it very simply, at the moment, this is if you look at the current box, when you get a product on the market, you get EMA marketing authorization from the EMA, then you get a baseline of 8 years of regulatory data protection. On top of that, you get 2 years of market protection. So your data is protected for 8 years, your market for additional 2 years. What will change is that the proposal now is that the regulatory data protection, the baseline should be 6 years only. And to get this baseline up to the same amount and even a higher amount than we have today, you can get additional 6 months if you do a comparative trial. You can get additional 6 months if you meet an unmet medical need. You can get additional 2 years if you launch the product in all member states within 2 to 3 years. And then you can get additional 1 year for a new indication. So that's kind of the whole concept around like the carrot and the stick, that if you do all of these things, and if it's feasible to do, which is of course something we're probably going to discuss in a minute, then it is possible to kind of get the same length of time. So this is, I would say, one of the core aspects, that you're not just going to get the baseline from the beginning, but you will have to meet a number of requirements. And I'm sure we're going to get into more details around this one, so I'll fastly go forward and say then one of the things that has also been debated quite a lot is this piece around taking a new indication, a new therapeutic indication, especially in the orphan medical space, where you would get currently 10 years of market exclusivity, and then taking a new therapeutic indication could actually give another 10 years for that new treatment. With the current proposal, that would be limited. So a new therapeutic indication would only grant 1 more year, and you could do this 2 times. And of course, this is one of the things also being debated. What impact would that have? And then moving forward to another of the big concepts of the pharma package, which is the unmet medical need and high unmet medical need. And this is a terminology that has been used previously, but mainly by, you can say, pricing authorities. The big change here is that the decision if a product will meet the requirements for an unmet medical need in the terms of the directive and high unmet medical needs for orphan medicines will really be a decision that will be taken at the point of marketing authorization. So again, here, the European Medicine Agency will have a much bigger role, and already during that process decide if the product will actually be kind of assigned to meet an unmet medical need. So that's one of the biggest changes, that that piece is moving to the regulatory part of the process, with again, EMA getting a very important role here. And then there's a small change also on the orphan designation, and maybe that's something we're going to discuss. What would that mean? Currently, you can say the definition itself is not changing, but what is changing is that there's an opportunity, you can say, to put additional requirements in, and the big change is really that the orphan designation, would be granted for 7 years. It can then be renewed, but it's not going to be an unlimited timeline. It is going to be 7 years only, and then that can be renewed on a request from the manufacturer. So I know I was rushing through this, but I didn't want to take too much time, but hopefully that kind of gives an idea about what are some of the main elements we currently see with the pharma package. And just reiterating again, for people who might have joined a bit late, this is a proposal. It's not a final piece of legislation yet, but it's a proposal from the European Commission as it is today. Thanks.
Thanks, Katja. So, I mean, there's a lot there. There's a number of changes. And at first glance, the reaction of a typical biotech founder or investor might be, well, what does this have to do with me? And it's only really when you begin to stop and think about what this impact means that the issue becomes more concerning. Before we dive into that, I want to take a moment to ask Sally to clarify something for us. And this is going to seem maybe really basic to some of you, but I find even at meetings with experts, the terms IP and market exclusivity and data exclusivity are thrown around interchangeably. And they're not really the same things. I mean, they are related. But Sally, can you take us through, what is... You're an IP, an intellectual property lawyer to begin with, right? So let's start with that. What is IP, and then what is data exclusivity, and what is marketing exclusivity? And in a nutshell, why are they all important? And how are they different? Is that a fair question?
It's a fair question. I should do my best to make it both clear for those whom it's new, and not too dull for those whom it's like falling off a log. If you lived and breathed pharmaceuticals for many, many years, you'll say, well, of course we know about that. But it's a fascinating area that you might think, if you're new to this, well, you make an invention and then you can sell it. Well, of course, that's not nearly all the picture. First thing you'll probably try and do is to secure a patent. And at first sight, a patent will give you a 20-year monopoly on that particular invention. You won't necessarily go through the hoops you have to go through to prove that it's an invention. It's a national right. It's not a global right. You have to choose where you're going to get that particular protection. And that 20 years doesn't give you a right. It means other people can't use that invention without a license from you. So it can be incredibly valuable. And when my time in-house, I knew that some of our big competitors would all be looking at the same area of chemistry or whatever, and days could make the difference, did make the difference between first to market and then the seconds who all have to take a license. My goodness, it makes a difference to the bottom line. So you got your 20 years, but in practice, bringing a product to market, going through all the regulatory hoops, proving its safety, its efficacy, being able to make it in a commercial way, means that you could be left with a really short period of actually being able to make the most of your invention. So you can apply for a supplementary protection certificate, which can give you up to another 5 years of exclusivity and monopoly on that product, the inventions in that product. And without getting too technical, that runs for a maximum of 15 years from the date on which you get your first registration in Europe. So if you got your first registration in 8 years, you get maximum 15 years. It would take you to 23 years from the date on which you got your patent. If, however, you get your marketing authorization at 15 years, then you'd still only get up to 25 years. You don't get 5 years SPC. It's always limited to 5 years. So that's all very attractive, and it's only part of the story. So recognizing that showing that safety and efficacy and so on, putting together the dossier, which gives you the right to sell, is an incredibly risky and expensive process to go through. The innovators are given further protection. The first is data exclusivity. So this is the data within the dossier that you've put together. It's a period of time during which an applicant, so this is another applicant for a marketing authorization, cannot rely on data in support of another marketing authorization, the purposes of submitting an application. This means you can keep out the generics or the hybrids or the biosimilars for a period of time, because the EMA won't consider them because you've got data exclusivity. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to the detail that Katja set out, opened the argument so beautifully about, it used to be famously 821, new therapeutic period of data exclusivity, marketing exclusivity, and then new product. But now we've got so many different slices. To get to that ultimate period, you have to go through these other hoops, which is obviously quite controversial. And we'll just finish with what market exclusivity, which is different again. This is granted. It means that a marketing authorization will not be granted to a generic, a hybrid, or a biosimilar. It can't be placed on the market. So you can go all the process, you might have access to the dossier, but you'll be kept out of the market because you won't be able to have a right to sell it. So you might have a marketing authorization, but you have the market exclusivity. So you can see how all these different rights, orphan drugs, pediatrics, new therapeutic indications, can all build up to a really valuable basket of rights, a thicket, you could say, like a patent thicket. You can also get new protection for your product by combinations and so on. So it's a complicated area, and it's all being reviewed under this pharma package. So I hope that gave some oversight.
Yeah, Sally, I think that's very helpful, because it's a lot to think about, but it begins to lead us to, why are these issues important? And you know, I think if we stop and think, for a biotech company that spends quite a lot of time just raising the money and then more time doing the various studies and trials, they use up a lot of their patent life before they're ready to license, let alone before they're ready to, you know, before one of their products is brought to market by one of, you know, by one of their licensees. I want to take a step back, Katja. I'm going to ask you to give us sort of the industry perspective, not the biotech perspective. When we just to sum it up very simply, and maybe Mark, you want to jump in here as well. I realize you're a principal scientist at industry, not a you know, a product manager. But still, I think the perspective is important from a big pharma or large biotech perspective. What is the impact of losing potentially a few years of data exclusivity or marketing exclusivity?
Well, it's a good question. Of course, depends a lot on the therapy. But I think the main concerns that are flagged, I think from the big industry, is really that it makes it less attractive to invest in Europe, and of course there's a huge concern, like how will this play out, kind of because one of the ambitions for the package is also to remain competitive, compared to kind of the US and Japan. So I think there's a huge concern that, of course, these 2 years that you're potentially losing is, of course, when the product is, I mean, kind of, you can say at a high curve in the market. I mean, this is when you're kind of trying to make your revenue for the investments you have already done in your R&D. So of course, it's very important that companies can see that they can get back their investments. And I think one of the big concerns that's also flagged is that this whole concept about that bigger companies will have to launch in all EU27 within 2 years, and smaller companies will then have 3 years. The whole concept about what it means to launch is not entirely clear yet. So I just want to say that this is still being discussed. What does it exactly mean to launch in a market? But the product needs to be available. And I think what a lot of pharma companies are saying is that this is concerning because it's kind of outside of their powers to decide how long, you know, HTA body in some country or a payer will take to make this decision. So it's going to be very difficult to comply with the timelines, and therefore they also, I think there's a huge concern, like how is it going to be, you know, playing off if you have this time pressure? Is that also going to be a kind of, you can say, a negotiation piece when you negotiate your price, because you only have this time to kind of get your product launched to actually get those 2 years that you kind of has as you can say the reward if you manage to launch. So you get those 2 years additional RDP. So there's a lot of concerns and also discussions about, you know, is it feasible? Because some of this is not necessarily something that the companies themselves are in full control over.
Thanks, Katja. And you've brought up an issue I wanted to get to, which was actually in my next question. If we look at the 2 years for, you know, industry and 3 years for small companies to launch in all 27 EU markets, you know, realistically, it's not impossible that a company that qualifies as an SME brings a drug to market itself, but it is extremely rare. I mean, the vast majority of the time in biopharma, a small or mid-sized company is licensing to a big biotech, a mid-sized biotech, a very large biotech to finish development and bring the product to market. So I think the question, you know, to what extent that 3 years will be available to anyone is a good question. You know, is it actually meaningful or not? But then I want to, as a result of what I just said, the biotech companies themselves generally aren't going to be the ones bringing the drug to market, right? And doing market launch. So, and Mark, you know, as somebody who's a serial entrepreneur and had a few exits, and you know, you're a chairman of several companies and an angel investor in others, why would this be important to a small company, whether in Europe or the UK? You know, assuming they're going to license the drug out, or they're going to be acquired outright as a company, they're very unlikely to bring a drug to market themselves. So why is this important at all?
A very good question. I mean, I think, you know, big pharma will look at this very differently than biotech for obvious reasons that you just alluded to. So I think when I was at Pfizer, we launched fluconazole, and maybe Sally might remember this because we had to pay, it was actually I think they did a deal with ICI as it was then. It's now a generic drug, so nobody cares, but I think from memory it was 10%. So obviously you had decided to come to an agreement rather than litigate with each other. But I do remember when I was at Pfizer, and I wasn't particularly involved in this, but with the Viagra patents, there was a huge litigation case between Pfizer and Lilly, ICOS. Lilly and ICOS was Bill Gates's company at the time, who claimed that Pfizer had used PDE5, recombinant PDE5 to discover it. And basically, I mean, it was a case where the litigation paid off, certainly for Pfizer, because I believe they kept Lilly out of the market for several years, or at least several months, which, you know, was billions of pounds. So I think big pharma think totally differently about the problem than the small biotechs. And I think, you know, perhaps in the fluconazole example, you know, Pfizer patented too late, and maybe big pharma is always thinking about patent life and they patent too late. We in biotech patent too early because we need to go out to biotech investors and say, hey, we got a patent, isn't that wonderful? So ultimately, biotechs will be thinking, you know, and then we work in this weird twilight world. It's a bit like cryptocurrency. It's called bioworld dollars, which anyone outside the biotech world will not understand. But it's all about future royalty streams, which are mostly fantasy, but in some cases become reality, right? But most cases they're written off, right? They're like cryptocurrency, and you've lost the laptop. So I think, you know, what you'll say is, if you're going to do a deal with a so would you then salami slice your European revenues? Because normally you say an ideal biotech, what does success look like? Well, ideally you sell your company to a big pharma who gives you cash upfront. Fantastic. You've got liquid stock on a tradable stock exchange, or they do a bioworld dollar deal with you. And you say, well, I'm going to do a deal in Europe, I'm going to do a deal in China, I'm going to do a deal in the US, I'll do a deal in India and the rest of the world, or whatever it is. And we'll tot it all up. It will come to a big number. I guess what it does for the biotech entrepreneur or CEO or board is, how in the hell do you do the maths in Europe now? Because it's going to change the maths a bit. And so what it will say is, well, hey guys, that's your problem. We want more cash up front, and we're going to take less carry. So I think, you know, if I were sitting in a biotech and I were doing a deal, I would talk tough, much tougher now with a European pharma who's going to launch in Europe for European revenues. And I'd say, I want cash up front. With America, rightly or wrongly, I may assume I'm going to get more money back, and therefore I'll do a more of a buy deal dollar. So I think it will maybe shift the deal structure with European companies over time. But, you know, that's just my view, and this is more of a position, you know, I'm trying to crystal ball gaze here, but I think it will change the perceived bioworld dollar market, which basically what enables us to go back to VCs and say, hey, look, we've done this deal in bioworld dollars, aren't we wonderful? Give us some more money for the next project. So I think that will shift. And I think the other thing that, just following on from what Sally said, which I thought was really important, you know, we all think in small molecules about composition of matter, but there's a myriad series of other patents you can build up your defensibility. And I think you can say, okay, we're going to lose something on the small molecule patent. Fine, you know, that go away. But, you know, we used to call it Pfizer, we used to call it evergreening. But basically, you can have a formulation patent, a digital biomarkers patent, another patent, another patent, another patent. So if you can compensate for you're losing a few years on your composition of matter, but you can actually, you know, use the data exclusivity to actually extend that, so you can compensate for that. So my guess is, and this is from a position of ignorance rather than knowledge, the devil will be in the detail. But ultimately, if I take my biotech and pharma hat off and give my patient's hat, this is not really relevant, actually. What is important is pricing and reimbursement. And actually, the European Commission has completely sidestepped the major issue, which is, how do you get pricing and reimbursement? Because even in the UK here, we're outside the EU, but that's devolved to Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and it's devolved to all of the European member states. So, you know, there's this sort of fiction that we're trying to create a sort of centralized market, when in fact, you haven't, or they haven't. You know, they completely sidestepped the whole thing. They've ignored it. And basically, as we all know, one of the big issues in the EU is that drugs are moving across borders with different rates. So in essence, this is sort of, I think, a sort of fig leaf that doesn't actually solve the problem, as a patient, because it's what does what drug will your insurance company pay for? What company will the NHS pay for, your state insurance system? That's the real issue. That's the elephant in the room. And my view is this whole legislation, either you grab the bull by the horns and you make a difference, but this is sort of, I don't think it's sort of a halfway house that doesn't keep anyone happy. But that's more of a position as a patient rather than a business person.
But I thank you, Mark. I think that's a really important point, because at the end of the day, I don't think any of us in the biotech sector disagree with the objective of achieving more equitable access to medicines across the EU 27 and even globally, if and when it's possible. The question is, will this achieve this, or will this simply complicate the process of actually financing and developing and bringing drugs to market? My first thought as I listened to you about biotech being a little harder on European pharma in the negotiations, I was also wondering if pharma is going to be harder on biotech, because they're going to say, look, we've now got to launch in 27 countries in 2 years, and that's a lot of additional expense, and the pricing may get pulled down as we have to go into lower cost countries earlier on. So I wanted to ask about that, and then I wanted to ask both Mark and Sally, when you're looking at, I know you're not writing business plans, but you see them, and you see licensing strategies and market entry strategies. Have you ever seen one that has a strategy and have financial projections for all EU 27 countries? I mean, usually what we see is the US, or the US plus the EU 4 or 5 plus Japan, maybe, sometimes with China, sometimes rest of world. So we're not even doing the calculations now, and I wonder if the net result of this is pharma is going to say to biotech, now we've got 5 times the cost to launch in Europe that we would have had prior to this. So therefore, we're not going to pay you anything up front. I don't know. I'm just trying to think this through. The other thing I think, Sally, is, I don't know when you're planning to retire, but you might want to postpone it, because lawyers are going to be very busy figuring out structures.
I think you're absolutely right. You've absolutely hit the nail on the head with that complication on forecasts of how you're going to roll out. And you're absolutely right. You'd go for US, Japan, Big 5 in Europe, and now, of course, that may or may not include the UK. But how often do you see 27 countries actually listed? You simply don't. They'd get swept along in due course, with the great wave. Obviously, it's been a while, but centralized marketing applications makes that much more straightforward. But the actual getting the drug to all 27 markets is quite a big ask. You've got negotiations on price. You've got local packaging. The product may not actually be suitable or the presentation may not be suitable for a particular market. There are so many more hurdles to overcome, and it sounds great, but you'll have seen from some of the commentary the reaction from a small country compared to a big country with lots of big pharma and big biotechs is quite different about the impact this will have on the market. Just one final thought. I know we're biotech oriented. I think you can say small and medium-sized pharma is equally affected by this. They won't have presence all over the EU at all. It's a big challenge, and there may need to be a bit more carrot and a bit less stick.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because if you think of smaller biotech, even if they get to the point where they're exit ready in terms of a license, they don't necessarily have somebody willing to license in every single market. They might have one global license on the table. They may just have somebody that wants the US, right? And that's it. That may be the only offer on the table for them. So they're going to take that. But an EU mid-size or small pharma that makes their business bringing products to market in certain European countries, most of them are not set up for all 27. I want to get back to, and this is a tough one because there's no easy solution. And Katja, I'm going to throw this one back to you in a second. But Mark, you pointed out correctly that it's a bit of a fig leaf, right? The idea is ensuring access across Europe. Well, the solution to that is to have one regulatory approvals and one pricing and reimbursement process, and then the product should be available across Europe. But the member states will never agree to that. So Katja, you talked about competencies and, which, when are member states in control, when is the European Commission in control, and the European Commission trying to achieve a European aim of equitable access without really having control over the issues that would ensure that, right? So is that why some of these mechanisms or proposed measures are a little bit clunky? Can you sort of, I mean, you touched on that, but, explain to us, why can't we have all 27 EU member states just come together next month and agree that there's one approvals, one pricing and reimbursement, done by the EMA or another agency, and that's it. It's on the market in Europe. I mean, I think our sector would love that, but it's not going to happen. Why is that?
I mean, I think it's a very complicated question, and there are probably many right answers to it. I mean, I think clearly there was a kind of, there was a push from a number of member states for the Commission to put something on the table that would address kind of access, affordability across Europe. And again, because of the competences they have, I mean, the main tool they can use is at the point of marketing authorization. So that's kind of where they can kind of say, okay, we can put this kind of, you can get a carrot for kind of that additional launch. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions, of course, on the Commission has kind of, you can say that they have done a little bit their part of the job, which is they can put a proposal and they can only do it within the mandate they kind of have in terms of the powers and the competences. Then, of course, the question is now I would say the member states have been not very engaged this far because there's been a lot of other legislation on the table. And also, I think for a lot of the member states, they also internally had to figure out, what is really the national mandate. So a lot of the member states we've seen have, like, for example, Ireland had big consultations to really ask, the industry nationally and ask a lot of stakeholders, what do we actually think about those elements? So I think what we have seen so far is probably the last year, a number of the 27 member states have really spent a lot of time to kind of get their position in place and be clear, what do we actually think about this proposal? So what is, of course, going to be very interesting now is to see, what will be coming out of it. What if not this model with modulation and launch, and there's already in the Parliament been thrown different proposals around what could it look like? Would it be that you kind of divide the two? So you say, the regulatory process is one thing, but then gives the mandate to member states so they could, for example, give you an economic fine if you don't, file for the price and reimbursement. So I think there's a lot of models at the moment you could consider, and I think that's what we're going to see for the coming years is, of course, this discussion about, like, if member states stay firm that they want this, access across for all EU 27, then what is really the right solution, and what does launch also mean? How is it price reimbursement? Is it the intention to launch? What is it? So I think there's a lot of devils in the details still, and you can say, would the solution just be kind of to do it all at EU level? I think there would also be a lot of different positions on that piece. I mean, you can say that kind of, to a certain extent, was what happened during the COVID pandemic, that the Commission got a mandate to actually, on behalf of all member states, purchase COVID vaccines with exactly the same logic, being, if we don't do it now, probably, France, Germany will be out of lockdown very soon, but then we will have countries who can be in lockdown for the next 15 years because they'll not get the vaccines. So you have seen in a huge crisis situation, then the Commission actually got the mandate to do procurement on behalf of all member states. But without a crisis, it's not, I think, at least short term, likely to happen for other therapies. So I don't know if that answered the question, but I think there's a lot of moving pieces at the moment.
But I think you hit the nail on the head. Is everyone talks about health equality, but nobody actually defines what they mean. So in the UK, we have a national health system which is supposed to deliver health. It doesn't, but at least that's its intention. That's what it's sent out to do. And clearly within most countries, and sadly not so quickly in Africa and elsewhere in South America, they said we need health equality on vaccines, and therefore we're just going to pay for it, right? We're not, basically the government, I think in nearly every, even in the US, correct me if I'm wrong, or Christian, the US government paid for the vaccines. It didn't come through insurance companies, did it?
No.
So I think if you that is saying, well, everybody who wants a vaccine can have one, right? That's health equality. You can argue that it's going to be delivered at different rates. The problem is everyone talks about health equality, but nobody's actually thinking about how we're going to deliver it. And this doesn't actually solve the problem, because if you had, you would get the same healthcare in Stuttgart as you would get in Bucharest, as you get in Athens, and you don't, right? And that's not going to happen. So I think what this potentially could do is act as a disincentive to investment for innovation, but actually not deliver the health equality that everyone wants, and actually could put European member states at the back of the queue rather than the front of the queue. I would argue that America, we all think the FDA is all powerful, which it is, and everyone will, go on bended knee to the FDA. But actually, it's a highly fragmented market, because you've got to talk to Kaiser Permanente, you've got to talk to United Health, you've got to talk to the US veterans, all of whom will have a very different policy, have a different pricing thing. But at least you know how the system works, right? You understand the thing. If you go to Brazil now, single jurisdiction, big companies, one language, boom, India, you know what you're doing. So I think, what the EU needs to think is the competition is not within itself. The competition is global competition. And actually, you either fix the problem properly and centrally plan it, but if you fiddle around the edges while Rome burns, I can't see how anyone wins here. Who wins? I mean, fundamentally, and I'm going to make a political point here, the issue is we've been able to spend all this money on healthcare because we haven't had wars in Europe, right? That, we were spending, throughout history, we were spending somewhere between 20 and 50% of GDP on our military. We're now spending, I'm beginning to sound a bit like Donald Trump, and I hate to add I'm not. We're now spending less than 5%, a few percent. That's enabled us to spend all of this money on healthcare, which is great. I mean, I'm in healthcare. I think it's fantastic. I'm in the UK now. I'm 62. I can get free prescriptions. It's fantastic. I don't have to pay. However, if we are going to have to tool up again because of all the situation in Europe, which is makes me cry, all the work and blood that my parents and my grandparents have shed and fought for this, it's all coming back again. This is going to put massive pricing pressure on our healthcare systems if we're going to have to spend, 10% on our GDP. I believe the Russia is spending about 30% of GDP on its military now. That bankrupted the Soviet Union, basically. And so I think we're having to make some really difficult and complicated budgetary choices now as Europeans. And I disagree with you, Christian. I think the UK, we are still Europeans. We may not be technically in the EU, but we are still European, or at least culturally, I believe we are. I think there is this big existential threat happening in Europe, and I think it's going to change what we do and how we think. And this is just a sort of a relatively small fiddling around the edges, when I think healthcare globally needs a major structural change. But I'll stop sounding off now, and I've probably taken us all off on multiple tangents, but there's some food for thought, really.
I think there's a lot of food for thought there, Mark, and I will agree with you. In principle, I'll just say, in terms of a market, the UK is its own market right now. But I will say that there certainly is an EU Europe connection that won't go away. But I think this is a very important issue, because if we looked at pricing, right, and if companies could get access to 400 plus million patients in Europe easily, the models would work with lower pricing. You wouldn't have to push for going to the markets with the highest pricing first if it was standardized pricing across the whole EU. So, granted, this may not be the right approach, but I do want to think about some of the implications, because we may want to come back and say to the EU, hey, there are better ways to achieve this. And that might be investing in some of the lower cost markets in Europe in advanced manufacturing to lower the cost of product, especially when we get into complex molecules and advanced therapies and so forth. I mean, more and more of the pipeline in various indications is not small molecules anymore. So the cost of product is actually a big driver of the cost of therapy, not just in cell and gene therapies and CAR T therapy and so forth, but in many areas. So maybe there are other solutions that would make a lot of sense at a European level. But I want to take a look at some of the issues which could be potentially damaging for biotech. I mean, traditionally a strategy, the orphan designation and the incentives around that sort of fostered the creation of a market for the development of medicines for rare diseases and orphan indications, where the economics would not have justified it prior to that. So that's been around for some 20 years now. There's been a market. One of the strategies for companies developing risky, innovative therapies has been to say, let's try to develop it in a shorter time for this orphan disease designation, because we can do that faster, and the clinical trial may be 80 million, not 400 million, and we'll get to market in 6 years rather than 9. So let's do that, and then once we have it on the market and have proof in humans, as sort of phase 4 post-marketing data, let's then try and roll it out into oncology or this big chronic disease affecting tens or hundreds of millions of people across Europe, but for which the development costs are going to be exponentially higher. If we look at that now, and Sally, I'll ask you to talk about, are there solutions around IP and slight, recomposition of matter or reformulation or prodrugs or something, but is there a risk that one of two things happens? Either nobody develops the drug for that large indication because the extra year of marketing exclusivity doesn't justify the cost, or can we protect that with IP instead if it's done, properly? Or vice versa, is there a risk that, there's no longer an interest in doing the orphan disease designation because you'd rather have as much exclusivity as possible in the larger market? I don't know which is going to happen. I can foresee two possibilities. But you're part of what you do is you think of solutions, to how are we going to approach these problems. And Mark, is if a company you were invested in or was looking at this and had that orphan disease strategy of let's go for this niche orphan indication, then let's roll out into these other indications, you've got at most 2 more other indications where you can get marketing exclusivity for 1 each. So the sort of platform approach, we're going to develop the same drug and then adapt it into 7 or 8 different indications, each one a larger but more expensive development. Is that still viable? And if it is, how do we have to start thinking about that? Because there are a lot of companies pursuing strategies along those lines, and the ground may shift under them.
You want me to try and sort of, because I think maybe Sally can answer the question. I think the question I would ask is, say you get it approved for an orphan indication, right, of which there are 100,000, 50,000 patients worldwide, when I say in Europe. The physician, that we know it works, it's say for example, it's an anti-amyloid drug, and we know it clears amyloid from the brains of very rare form of frontotemporal dementia, right? Done, fantastic data, we've got the patent. A physician now wants to prescribe it for someone who has another type of Alzheimer's disease, not familial, some sort of sporadic form. There's good anecdotal evidence it'll work. How does that get paid for? And then can they charge the same price for the sporadic sufferer versus the one who's got the disease? Because I think if you can, it's a sort of backdoor way into getting reimbursement without having to do that really big, expensive, $100 billion, say $1 billion Alzheimer trial.
So you're looking at sort of named patients and that sort of thing. So I think that's a winning idea for the pharma company, the biotech company, because the risk in prescribing is on the doctor if it's not for the named indication. But there'd probably be a lot of people who are prepared to take that risk. often at this stage, though, companies are giving their products out for free, aren't they? So it's a slightly different model. You're trying to develop your data by making people use it. So it's a bit circular, isn't it? I know it sounds attractive if the NHS or other reimbursement agencies were saying, yep, we'll pay. But in my experience, it's at least as likely that the company is trying to prove their way by getting a cohort of patients who will respond well. And then they say, look, and then we'll take it to the US and we'll get paid there. Or something
you're
like
right. You're absolutely spot on. Is ethically, not even the baddest of bad pharmaceutical company was saying, we've given it for free to this patient group, they're responding, we're now going to take it away and make them pay $100,000 a year or something like that. I mean, it could happen, I suppose, but I think that they would look so bad. I don't think they'd do it, right?
Yeah, under the legislation certainly in the UK, and I know it's the same in Germany. I've just last week been looking at something. You can withdraw that sort of named indication. You're not stuck on providing 100,000 a year forever. Part of you wants to because it's having such a positive effect, but it's a different economic sort of model from what we're looking at about launching a biotech in 27 different countries, isn't it? Where your hurdles are different. So,
Oh, Sally, you've gone on mute somehow.
did I get anywhere on that? Did I just do that then?
You just said until your hurdles are different, and then it just I think you just tapped something somehow.
I clicked it with my spare thing. Yeah, so you'd asked me to consider IP opportunities. Can you be creative with your IP? And I think I don't know that this is a particularly ripe area for this. You can have the usual, new indications, new therapeutic indications, but you have hurdles to go over. Then it's not going to be very easy. And the companies that specialize in orphan drugs have a particular economic model, which knows that it's going to be a limited market, and they are set up for that. They're not generally working at sort of creating, as I mentioned before, sort of patent thicket, but more sort of focused on one or two things. So in the context of the orphan drugs, the orphan incentives for market exclusivity under the new Pharma package, that's generally been, it's had a mixed response, I'd say, but there are those that definitely see the further opportunities, such as the applications made with bibliographic data only. You get a shorter protection, but that's going to be cheaper, isn't it? So that's going to be an attractive route for an orphan drug company to go down.
So I want to shift gears and ask a slightly different question. I mean, if we think back, part of the political concern that led to this, ongoing process was the idea that some big pharma are very clever about salami slicing. They have a drug and then they slice off a thin amount and they get another, several years protection and premium pricing and a new indication. And then they do it again and they do it again and they keep the same compound, protected and at premium pricing for a long time by going into other indications. And politically, that doesn't sound appealing, right? Now, if you stop and think about that compound for the original disease is no longer getting premium pricing in that indication, right? But it is in the other indication. So it's come down for the patients who are being treated or the payers, in the disease it was initially developed for. But I want to ask a question in terms of, it could be chronic disease, but let's think about rare disease. Mark knows I've been very focused on the CNS neuroscience area the past few years. And if we look at rare diseases, rare neurological disorders they tend to cluster. And there are a lot of rare diseases, and some of them, a similar mechanism of action and approach may work in a rare neurological disease that also works in another neurological condition, right? So you might say there's an opportunity to develop this drug. It looks really good for Fragile X syndrome. With a reasonable cost in several years, we could potentially bring a transformative drug to market for children with Fragile X. But then, having done that, we could say, okay, now it makes sense to develop this for all people with autism, right? Which is going to be much more expensive. The risk here, and then you could say, okay, now we can also develop this for different neurological conditions where there are stereotypic movement disorders, right? Which are also orphan indications, all of which are poorly treated. Frankly, there are not good solutions. Is there a risk that this sort of approach means biotech and even pharma companies no longer consider developing that same drug, first for one, but then for multiple other conditions where there really is an unmet medical need? This is my concern, right? I mean, I don't think it's uninnovative to take a drug developed for Fragile X and then say, maybe this can help in Tourette's, or maybe this can help in autism generally, or in certain types of autism spectrum disorder. And then maybe this can help in tardive dyskinesia, which is not an orphan condition by any case, right? But it is a big market. There are drugs on the market, but they could be much better drugs on the market. So this is the way, is this goal of saying we'll incentivize innovation by disincentivizing repurposing drugs for new conditions? Is there a risk that this is actually killing innovation and reducing the flow of novel, innovative therapies to patients who need them? I think you know what my opinion is, but I prefer to ask people that have a lot more expertise on these issues. How would you look at this? Because that is my concern, that all of a sudden it's just unviable. There's no way to say we're going to develop solutions for patients in all of these diseases. You're going to have to just pick one, maybe two, and that's it.
Yeah, but basically you've hit the nail on the head. It's a pricing and reimbursement issue rather than a regulatory issue, right? I mean, ultimately, and I think that's the issue that really needs to be resolved, not just across the Europe, but globally. But it's very, very hard to do. But I think you're right. I mean, I think who is sort of stepping into the void here? I think it's our saviors, for want of a better term, are the massive, big, not-for-profit organisations. Bill and Melinda Gates, Wellcome Trust, Cancer Research UK, all of these big, Emerson Collective, these big foundations. I think, I mean, if you look at malaria, who's actually doing something about it, right? It's these all. So I sort of slightly say, well, are the European Commission going to fix this? I suspect probably not. Can big philanthropic organizations who have that focus, right, because they are just going to treat one disease, or I think at the recent conference we were at in Amsterdam, Christian, you had that very nice story of a dad whose son had a really horrible disease and went off. And so I do think, why am I hopeful? Because I sound pretty bloody negative, and I apologize for that. But I think I do see venture philanthropy changing the whole face map of this. But maybe that just makes me feel better, but it's a thought.
I think it's certainly a positive. I'm still worried, about the general implications overall, because I know a lot of, PIs and startup companies that have this strategy, like we'll get traction here first, but our goal is to help all these patients, which, a bunch of rare diseases, but you add it up, it's a lot of people. And coming back also to, my conference in Amsterdam, the idea that as we start testing people with proper genetic testing, are these diseases as rare as we think they are? Or are they just underdiagnosed because, most patients never get the genetic testing? So it's a lot of patients. Sally, any thoughts on that? And I realize I'm asking you to ask, a financial and pricing and reimbursement question, which is not your core area, but certainly what you do touches on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if we're considering this in the context of the pharma package, if it's going to be better or worse. I think you're indicating it's going to be worse. But I do find Mark's comment that the entrepreneurs and these are still going to find this an interesting and sort of ring-fenced area that they may still get involved in. And you'll find those who approach things in a particular way to say, hey, we've got an opportunity there with the, let's get as you mentioned, a quicker route to market. Let's do some proof. We'll find a way. So I think those who want to always will do. I can understand your concern, but it's not the area of sort of real alarm that I've heard. It's a bit more niche, whereas these big things like, right, we're going back to here for data exclusivity, and you've got to do this has a more seismic impact, I have to say. I think there'll be still people interested in the orphan drugs because they've always had to find imaginative ways to do things.
I agree, and I think a lot of those orphan drugs do get funded by venture philanthropy, because you can see a real result. If you're a rich person and you want to make a difference, you want to make impact, I think that's going to happen. I think for me, and I've just been listening in here, so I'm very new to this, so apologies. The big issue that keeps coming back is you've got to launch on all 27 member states at once, right? Whereas if you're doing a biotech deal, you'd say, well, we're assuming we're going to launch in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and maybe one other. Mm-hmm. What do you think of someone who, I don't know who someone is, but a group of the relative people, and not me, but whoever, big pharma, little pharma, biotechs goes to, and say that's just not realistic. I mean, you can say you could either do it by X number of member states or X number of population across the European Union. Just saying it's got to be even Stevens for everybody is just not going to work. And in fact, it doesn't solve your problem, because even if you registered it in Romania, they're not going to buy it, right? So actually, you haven't solved anything. I don't know. Do you think that is an argument that A, would be helpful, B, the European Commission would listen to, and C, there's someone who can make it?
Katja?
I have to say that I'm not sure on this one. I wouldn't. I wouldn't know how to answer it, to be quite frank.
Yeah, I think it's Mark, it's a good point. And as we come into the last 10-15 minutes here, I want to touch on two different areas. One, because I am concerned that unless some of these things are revised a little bit, that it could have negative implications, for companies in certain areas in Europe, and also for the ecosystem, right? Because if the target market becomes the US and we're just saying, we'll deal with Europe eventually, then the investors are going to push to have the development team and the company based in the US, right? And this is not in Europe's interest in the long term. And if you're a European company and you would like to actually make a difference by bringing your drug to market in Europe, or licensing it to another company that can bring it to market, this may be a bit of a bottleneck on that process. Some of the things that are being proposed here, and I'm not sure some of the incentives proposed will be of any value to private biotech companies. So I wanted to ask two questions. The first is going to be a policy one. And, this is not just a European issue that should be discussed with the European Commission and in the European Parliament. It should be discussed in member states, right? And it should be discussed by entrepreneurs, by investors, by bioregions. To make an impact on policy and to try to get the stakeholders engaged on this, so that there are some tweaks to it, so that when it comes around, it's more likely to do something beneficial rather than act as a brake on innovation and reduce the flow of innovative medicines to patients. How would you recommend people, or bioregions or other stakeholders get involved? They don't necessarily need to fly to Brussels and ask for meetings at the Commission or the Parliament, right? But what should they be doing?
I mean, I think it's a very good question. I think at the moment we clearly see that some of the bigger pharma companies who have more resources to, also monitor what's going on the political side, what's the landscape. They can monitor very closely discussions in the Parliament, discussions among member states. We clearly see that larger pharmaceutical companies and their trade associations have been very vocal on this legislation and kind of upfront on raising really their concerns. I think there's clearly kind of a lack of the voices of, you know, some of the more, you know, early days startup, the bioclusters across Europe. Probably a lot of those are very focused on their science. They are not like necessarily, you know, following what's going on in the European Parliament, what's going on in Brussels. And I think for a lot of them, it's unfortunately that this kind of political process where all the discussions are happening now and opinions are being shaped now and also decisions are being made, it might kind of dawn on them a bit late that this is actually happening. And I think there's of course a real risk that both for the Commission, but in some cases also for member states, they mainly hear the voice of big pharma and maybe they miss some of the input from really some of the smaller, you know, pharma companies or biotech or even in academia who would say, you know, for this type of technology, this is a disaster because we just can't, you know, commercialize it in with these premises. And I think, I mean, just to say, I think right now there is definitely an opportunity. I mean, I would say at a national level to flag, you know, it could be ministers of health, it could be minister of finance, but really to come up with those arguments and also, you know, ask for exemptions and try to be very clear on, you know, what are the consequences and where is it that there could be exemptions on, you know, one of the discussions is what is actually a small, medium-sized enterprise? Is it the case where you have less than 5 kind of centralized marketing authorizations with the European Medicine Agency? Is that the case? Then everyone who has less than 5, that would be kind of falling under, they're small, they should have exemptions. So I think there's a huge opportunity at this moment to really raise their voices and also kind of really be you know, get into what aspects. I mean, there are probably aspects that, I mean, I think for a lot of companies, there are many aspects they don't like, but I think it's also about picking your battles and being, you know, what are the aspects that are really critical for business and which are the aspects where you might be, okay, it might be an additional burden, of course, with some of the environmental criteria and some of the additional data that is needed, but maybe that's less of a concern than some of the, you know, data protection. So I think clearly there is still an opening, I would say, and I think the big concern is that some of these you know, smaller companies might not hear about this legislation before it's actually very far advanced and maybe even at a point of where it is already being decided, which of course would be a shame.
And I think that's a very good point. And of course, I mean, I know Europa Bio and Claire Scantlebury and those lot, have they engaged with this? Because obviously they tend to represent the smaller businesses. And you could make the argument, and I'm just sort of talking out loud here, so correct if I'm wrong, the European Commission is putting a lot of tax euros into supporting these early stage companies and building our innovation base.
Yes.
X, Framework Y, Horizon 2020, whatever. So we're pouring the tax euros into the hopper. But actually, what you're now incentivizing those companies to do is to actually go and do deals with bigger venture-backed US, you know, eating red meat every morning VCs who are going to get the benefit from that. So is this actually servicing the constituent market of Europa Bio? Now, I put words into Claire Scantlebury's mouth, and I'm sure she could say it much more eloquently than I ever could. But is that an argument that could be made, or am I talking nonsense here?
Mark, I think that's a really key one, because we could even go earlier stage. And as Katja said, look at academia and the tech transfer offices that have technologies and platforms that they want to license out. And all of these have been financed to some extent with member state and European money, right? But it's easier to raise money for a company in a hot biotech region or cluster than it is outside of one. And you will not be able to raise money if the path to market has all of a sudden become more complicated. And even if there's still a market in the US, we can't assume in the long term investors are going to finance programs in Europe that are only targeting the US. And do we really want European investors investing in European science that doesn't target the European market and patient, but just sort of leaves them as an afterthought because the economics aren't there to target them initially? So these are the issues that I would raise for countries, for bioregions that have been investing and building this ecosystem in Europe, that it is a threat And there may be better ways to achieve things. And I'd like to spend the last few minutes on really what I think is the hardest part here. And Mark, you've been alluding to the fact that, you know, the process here is sort of a roundabout way of trying to achieve a result without really addressing the fundamental problems. But we need to address these. And for example, you know, I have it on my on my to-do list to reach out to you with an email about Bulgaria. And you know, I think you know why Bulgaria, but the reason I'm thinking is that, as I mentioned earlier, one of the major drivers of price, of high costs, is the cost of manufacturing and the cost of goods and drug products in any sort of complex molecule or advanced therapy. And Europe has a very, very limited amount of capacity for producing these. And most of that it's at, you know, big biotech, big pharma, a handful of very big biotech, and a handful of CDMOs, right? Europe is just now starting to address manufacturing and advanced biomanufacturing, sort of 5 years after the US dove in, and what's being proposed is not even a fraction of what the US has been doing. I wonder, in innovative regions, but which are still lower cost regions, and we could think of Bulgaria, Poland, the Ukraine eventually, a number of other countries. I know I'm excluding a bunch. That's not intentional. I just can't go through the whole list and we'll come out with 8 or 10 countries. Should we not be looking at saying, could member states, could private equity, could the European Commission be looking at prioritizing and risk sharing the development of an innovative advanced biomanufacturing sector that can help companies reduce the cost of developing their processes and producing drugs, so that we can actually drive the costs down, and by the way, then supply these manufacturing technologies to the rest of the world. I've spent a lot of time on these issues in the US, which is why I know about the programs there with the National Institute for Innovation in Manufacturing Biopharmaceuticals. I think Europe's going in the right direction, but we need to tie these issues much more closely and directly. So that's my idea. But what other things might be done in terms of broad initiatives that could really help actually ensure equitable access, or better and more equitable access across Europe to medicines, while addressing some of the fundamental problems of pricing, and also, you know, building and accelerating the biotech sector, which is an important economic sector for Europe, rather than potentially putting a brake on it. Any other thoughts of things we're not going to solve them today, but, you know, should we open up Pandora's box with a few ideas of areas that we should be looking into?
No, I think you make a very good point there, and I think the answer to your question is yes, right? You know, that's a really good idea, but obviously making it happen is really difficult. I mean, I think, you know, we've got an interesting debate here in the UK a moment about wind power, and I apologise for the rest of you not. Is that basically, you know, people who have all the big wind pylons, you know, with the big things near them, paying more expensive energy than someone in London. So they're saying, how are we going to sell this to the local people? We should give them cheap energy, or even free energy, if they agree to have this. So you could say, I'm remaining anywhere where you could say, okay, we're going to manufacture there, because you're manufacturing it and you're putting your sweat equity in, you're putting your money in, you're putting your euros in, you get it at a discounted rate, and that incentivizes you to do it. And years ago, I did something very similar. I keep mentioning South America, but I mentioned again in Peru, in Iquitos, which is a small part of Peru, just very close to the Brazilian border. And we were developing a product from the local people. The American pharmaceutical company that had come in was called Shaman Pharmaceutical Companies, and they took it away and sold it in America, and they burnt it down. So what we decided was to actually say, we're only going to employ local people to do it. You're going to get it for free. In fact, everybody in Peru gets it for free, and this is signed off by the mayor. So therefore, what have you got to lose? And actually, you coming and working in this factory is a lot better than you producing other sorts of pharmaceuticals, such as cocaine and other things. So, I mean, I wouldn't say it's quite success that I'm painting it, but you get the general trajectory.
Yeah.
This sort of it does start to tackle the problem of health inequality, which I think is the big fundamental issue that we're all trying to talk about here today.
And I think that's brilliant, Mark, and it also shares the benefit of the biotech economy. right? Which is clustered in several countries. We all know that, right? This is a way for other countries to be a part of that. And in an area which, by the way, is addressing one of the big bottlenecks on the future pipeline of therapeutics, right? So again, I'll reach out to you on that. And if anybody listening has an interest in that, just reach out to me on LinkedIn. Sally, and this may not be a policy issue, but what would you be recommending to, small and medium biotech, even big biotech and small pharma right now? What would you be recommending that they look at from a strategic perspective in terms of, protecting their own viability in the long term?
Well, I wonder if it comes down to partnering. If you're not big enough to do it on your own, it's a sort of a different approach from what you're saying about, Bulgaria, Romania, these smaller places, they can offer something special. Maybe you say, what is our differentiator? What makes us special? And maybe look for opportunities there rather than trying to grow like a mushroom and do everything in-house. I think you'll be looking for partnerships and licensing and so on, and collaboration on the basis that 2 and 2 could make 5. I think that's the basic thing, and to look constructively and creatively at the new opportunities if they are there. The problem is, and I think this is almost another subject again for another day, how are companies supposed to be acting when we're talking about this set of rules or this set of objectives, this set of incentives, and then it might look completely different in 2 or 3 years' time? So if you're thinking about your strategy, do you assume you have to do it with somebody else, or do you keep plugging away saying, I've got this great idea for this orphan drug? I think that is a real problem with a process that it's so all-encompassing. It's not just medical devices. It's not just clinical trials. It is the whole shebang, and how the whole biotech pharma market is going to be carried out in Europe for the next X years.
Sally, that's a really great comment. And it honestly comes back to the way the biotech world works, right? Which is, or has started to work over the past 20 years, which is focus on core competence, whether that's research, whether that's spin out and early, preclinical and early clinical development, whether that is, clinical development, regulatory and market launch, is really focusing on what we do best. I want to, at risk of putting words in your mouth, I want to think a little bit larger, because you're talking about partnerships, and is there a room, is there a room? I guess I'm a little tired. Is there room potentially for public-private partnerships to address this issue, to say, here is a mechanism where there's a public-private partnership to help with the market launch across all EU 27 countries, and maybe to help countries, get access where they might have a challenge otherwise. I see a couple of questions from David. I see Mark's been answering them. David, please email me on LinkedIn. You're raising very good points. But
well, I think it just comes back to your point, Christian, about manufacturing. I think David is saying, what about clinical trials, right? If you do clinical trials in these areas, and I think, as I happen to be sitting in the Wellcome Trust Sanger Centre at the moment, they have done a huge amount of work on malaria in Africa along similar lines, right? Is that we want to manufacture in Africa. We want to make sure it gets, because actually, if you block transmission, it's benefits for everybody, a bit like the COVID thing. So I do think it's looking at the whole ecosystem from manufacturing to clinical trials. Sorry to sort of jump in there, but I was just trying to support David's ideas. I think his comments in the chat box are very relevant and timely.
Yeah, I think so. The only time in the last 10 minutes of the call is when we tend to overlook them. But David, I think they're really good ones, and Mark's making a good point. But on that note, I want to ask Sally and Katja. I'm not necessarily talking about a new innovative medicines initiative, but is there a need potentially, or at least room for something where, in addition to a stick, I mean, yeah, okay, politicians want to punish big pharma. I understand that, but let's not critically injure biotech in the process, right? Because we do need this innovation. is there a way, is there some sort of public-private partnership that would, or at least mechanism to accelerate access to medicines across Europe in a way that actually benefits companies and makes investing in biotech in Europe more attractive, not less?
I think it's got to go that way. I think that the number of hurdles and the sticks are too many not to have a real public investment. So public-private, I think, is the way things will have to go. How you get agreement across 27 countries is going to be a huge, huge issue. And I think that's going to be the biggest problem, where you've got the interests of France, Germany, big biotech industries, and those where they really want the products but don't have the wherewithal to help to create them. So there has to be a sort of overarching, this is better for society to have access to new medicines. It's good for us to have innovative, creative industries within Europe to make us be able to compete with the rest. We don't just want to import from outside. So we need someone far-sighted, long-sighted, and with a real vision for how it could work, and to sell that, and not just look for the next 2 years till the next parliament. But I think that's the way to go. I think it's great what you're saying.
Thanks, Sally. So hopefully that message gets in front of some of the right people. I think we're a minute over schedule. Katja, I asked you to give a talk. Is there a last message you'd like to leave as we wrap up?
Yeah, well, I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and again, thanks a lot for the invitation. I think it's for this piece, I think it's just very important. I mean, you said, Mark, biopharma, are they kind of engaging? I think the trade association very much. I mean, clearly, a lot of the trade associations are very active on this, but I think it's super important that, the kind of the more early stage, biopharma and maybe smaller companies and the bio clusters. I think it's really important to engage in this discussion and be active and get their voice through. I would say rather do it now than in 2 years when most of the decisions have already been made. So that would probably be my last, encouraging more, of the different voices really to engage and kind of look at the legislation and have a real assessment of what the impact could be. And maybe also, I think also, of course, it's always easier to say the aspects you don't like, but also propose alternatives. Like, what could be an alternative? What are the constructive solutions to kind of get to, if we want to give access, what could it look like? I think that's the big question.
Katja, I think that's an awesome point to end up on, sort of a call to action to the very creative people in the biotech sector in Europe. What can we do to help in achieving the goals? Because I've grumbled a bit about some of the issues. I don't like some of what's proposed. I think it's risky with limited benefit, but the objectives make sense. So what could we really do? And if any of us can help you make those happen or get the right people together, I assume Sally, Mark, Katja, myself, we're happy to hear from you on interesting ideas or initiatives and see if we can support those. So with that, I want to thank Katja, Sally, and Mark. I think it's an important issue that we generally are not paying enough attention to in biotech. And hopefully this has raised some awareness. And I see Connor still there for Biotechgate Digital Partnering, waiting for us to wrap up. But hopefully they can blast this out and get this in front of another several hundred people and go beyond that. But thank you to David and the other participants today for your questions. And let's see if we can improve the situation going forward rather than just accepting a suboptimal set of legislation, which has some good objectives, but maybe could use some better mechanisms. So thanks to all of you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.